Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. I'd been needing a break, a real one, for the longest time. My job as an ER nurse had taken its toll, and I was running on fumes. I'd heard of a secluded camping spot up in the Blue Ridge Mountains, away from the crowded trails and families with their screaming kids. It was supposed to be peaceful, isolated, a place to lose yourself in the quiet. I decided to take a few days off, packed my gear, and drove out early that morning. The road twisted and turned through the mountains, winding higher into the forest until I reached the unmarked trailhead. I liked the idea that this place wasn't on any map. The less known, the better. I started my hike, feeling the tension slowly leaving my shoulders with each step. The trail was narrow, barely more than a deer path in some spots, and the trees crowded close on either side. It was perfect. About 4 miles in, I found a small clearing by a creek. The water was clear and cold, bubbling over rocks and fallen branches. I pitched my tent and set up camp, thinking about nothing more than roasting marshmallows and staring at the stars. By mid-afternoon, I'd settled in. The sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows that danced with the breeze. I sat on a fallen log, enjoying the stillness, when I heard it. A rustle, faint but deliberate, from somewhere deeper in the forest. I figured it was probably a deer or maybe a fox, nothing to worry about. But the sound persisted, growing closer until it seemed to be circling the clearing. I stood up, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. The feeling that crept up my spine wasn't fear, not yet, but a sense that something was off, like the way you feel when you enter a room and know someone's been there before you. As the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling. I tried to distract myself with dinner, but my nerves were frayed. I kept glancing around, catching movement out of the corner of my eye, but every time I looked directly, there was nothing. Just the trees swaying, the creek flowing, the fire crackling. I told myself I was just on edge from work. Too many hours, too much stress. But when I turned in for the night, I couldn't sleep. The noises from the woods had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed in on my tent like a living thing. I lay there, every sense on high alert, straining to hear anything. Around midnight, I heard it again, a rustling, slow and deliberate, moving closer. I held my breath, listening. The sound circled the tent, pausing now and then like something was inspecting it. I reached for the knife in my pack, my heart pounding. I didn't want to unzip the tent and look. I didn't want to know what was out there. The noise stopped right outside my tent, and I could hear breathing, deep and wet. It wasn't human. The breath was too labored, too heavy, and it made my skin crawl. I lay there, frozen, clutching the knife like it was the only thing keeping me alive. The breathing moved around to the other side of the tent, then slowly faded into the distance. I didn't sleep after that. I couldn't. I just lay there, knife in hand, waiting for the sun to rise. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped the tent cautiously, knife still at the ready. There were deep indentations in the earth around my tent, like something heavy had been pacing. Whatever it wasn't human. The tracks looked almost like a bear's, but larger, and the claw marks were deeper, sharper. I packed up my gear, my mind racing. I'd never seen tracks like these, and I'd worked in enough remote areas to know what animals lived in these woods. This was different, something unknown. I debated hiking out immediately, but I was deep in now, and the thought of rushing back through those narrow trails didn't sit well with me. Instead, I decided to stay close to camp, keep the fire going, and wait it out. Maybe it was just a fluke, a bear with a limp or something. But as the day wore on, that sense of unease only grew. The forest felt too quiet, like it was holding its breath. I kept the knife close, never venturing far from the fire. My phone had no signal out here, and the idea of trying to hike out with that thing, whatever it was, possibly tracking me, was enough to keep me rooted. By late afternoon, I started to hear it again. The rustling, the slow, deliberate steps in the brush. I kept the fire stoked high, hoping it would stay away. But it didn't. As dusk fell, the rustling grew closer, circling the camp just out of sight. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there, watching, waiting. When night finally fell, the noises stopped again, replaced by that oppressive silence. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, trying to stay awake. I knew if I fell asleep I wouldn't wake up. Around midnight I heard it again, the breathing, that wet, labored sound closer than before. I could see the firelight reflecting off something just beyond the tree line, a shape low to the ground, too large to be anything I recognized. It moved closer, stepping into the edge of the firelight, and I got my first real look at it. The thing was massive, its body covered in matted fur, but its face was wrong. It was like someone had taken a bear and twisted it, giving it a muzzle that was too short, eyes that were too far apart, and a mouth full of jagged teeth that didn't fit. The worst part was its hands, long, bony fingers tipped with claws that were more like knives than anything natural. It stood there, just watching me, its breath rasping in and out like it was struggling to keep itself together. I didn't dare move. I knew that if I did, it would attack. The fire was the only thing keeping it at bay, and even that seemed to be losing its effect. Then, without warning, it lunged. I barely had time to react, throwing myself to the side as it swiped at where I'd been standing. The force of its movement sent me tumbling into the dirt, and I scrambled to my feet, knife in hand, as it circled around for another attack. I didn't think, I just acted. As it lunged again, I thrust the knife forward, catching it in the side. It let out a sound, an awful, high-pitched screech that sent chills through me, and stumbled back, clawing at the wound. Blood, thick and dark, oozed from the gash, but it didn't stop. It came at me again, and I stabbed it once more, this time aiming for its throat. The knife hit home, and the thing reared back, gurgling. It thrashed, its claws raking the air before collapsing in a heap by the fire. I stood there, panting, watching as it bled out, the life slowly draining from its twisted body. When it finally stopped moving, I collapsed beside the fire, the adrenaline leaving me weak. I stared at the thing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen, what I'd just done. But there were no answers, just the reality of what lay before me. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire going, watching the body to make sure it didn't get up. But it didn't. By morning, the thing was stiff, its body still there, a testament to the nightmare I'd survived. I packed up my gear, my hands shaking, and started the hike back. I didn't look back. There was nothing left for me there. I made it to my car by midday, exhausted but alive. As I drove away, I thought about what had happened, what I'd seen, but there was no understanding it, no logic to apply. All I knew was that something was out there, something that didn't belong, and I had the scars to prove it. When I finally reached the nearest town, I went straight to the ranger station. I told them what happened, showed them the knife, still stained with the thing's blood. They believed me, though I don't know if they'll ever find it, but that's not my problem anymore. I'm done with camping. It was one of those damp, fog-laden mornings where the moisture hung heavy in the air, clinging to everything, even the thoughts in your mind. That's what I remember most about that day. The oppressive weight of the mist as it swallowed up the world around me. My name's Bryce Harding, and I've never been one to shy away from a challenge. Maybe it's the way I was raised, always pushing boundaries, never satisfied with the easy path. But that's what got me out there in the first place, alone in the heart of the Allegheny National Forest. I've always had a thing for remote places, the kind where you're more likely to encounter a black bear than another person. It's not that I'm antisocial or anything. I just prefer the kind of quiet that only deep wilderness can offer. I've hiked through the Rockies, trekked across the deserts of Utah, and even spent a week lost in the Everglades once. But this was something different. The Alleghenies are wild in a way that's hard to describe unless you've been there yourself. It's not just the dense forests or the seemingly endless miles of rugged terrain. It's the feeling that the land itself is alive, watching, waiting. I'd set up camp a few miles off the main trail, near a small, nameless stream that fed into the larger Allegheny River. The day before had been uneventful, just me in the woods, the way I liked it. I'd spent the morning fishing, pulling a couple of decent-sized trout from the stream, and the afternoon exploring the area, making mental notes of the terrain. It wasn't until the sun dipped below the horizon that things started to feel off. You see, in the forest there's a rhythm, a cadence to the sounds of nature. The rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant call of a bird, the babble of water over rocks. It all blends together into a kind of natural symphony. But that night, as I sat by my campfire, I realized something was missing. The woods were silent. No insects buzzing, no frogs croaking, nothing. It was as if the forest had taken a deep breath and was holding it, waiting for something to happen. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear something, or think I did. A rustle, a snap, the sound of something moving through the underbrush. I kept telling myself it was just nerves, that I'd spent too many nights alone in the wilderness to let my imagination get the better of me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I woke up early, the fog even thicker than before, obscuring everything beyond a few feet from my tent. I decided to break camp and head deeper into the forest, figuring I'd explore a bit more before heading back to civilization. I'd just finished packing up when I heard it. A low, mournful howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard before. Too deep to be a coyote, too drawn out to be a wolf. It was something else, something that sent a chill down my spine despite the humidity. I stood there for a moment, trying to get a fix on where the sound was coming from, but the fog made it impossible. It seemed to be moving, echoing through the trees in a way that disoriented me. I grabbed my pack and rifle, slinging both over my shoulders, and started walking, trying to shake the unease that had settled in my gut. As I moved deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around me, the undergrowth growing thicker and more tangled with every step. The air grew heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the fog clung to the ground like a shroud. I kept hearing things, branches snapping, leaves rustling, that same low howl, now closer, now farther away. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that something was tracking me through the mist. I'm not one to spook easily, but by midday I was starting to think maybe I should turn back. That's when I found the clearing. It was a strange place, an oval patch of land devoid of trees or vegetation, just a circle of bare earth surrounded by the dense forest. The ground was uneven, pockmarked with holes and ridges as if something had been digging there recently. At the center of the clearing was a large flat stone, its surface cracked and weathered, covered in strange symbols that looked ancient, older than the trees that surrounded it. I approached the stone cautiously, my rifle at the ready, though I couldn't say what I was expecting to find. As I got closer, I noticed that the symbols were carved deep into the rock, each line sharp and precise, despite the erosion that had worn away the edges of the stone itself. I reached out to touch it, and that's when I felt it. A sudden, overwhelming sense of dread that made my skin crawl. It was as if the air around the stone was charged with some kind of energy, something dark and ancient. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest, and that's when I heard it again, the howl, closer now, almost directly behind me. I spun around, raising my rifle, but there was nothing there. Just the fog, thick and impenetrable, swirling around the edge of the clearing. And then I saw it. At first I thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the light or my imagination, but as it moved closer I realized it was something else entirely. It was tall, taller than any man, with long spindly limbs that moved in a jerky, unnatural way. Its skin was a sickly mottled gray, like something that had been dead for a long time but refused to rot. It moved on all fours, its limbs too long and its body too thin, its head large and misshapen, with a wide mouth that stretched from ear to ear, filled with sharp, jagged teeth. I froze, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The creature stopped at the edge of the clearing, its head tilted to one side as if it was studying me. Then, slowly, it began to move forward, its body undulating like a snake as it slithered across the ground. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I raised my rifle and fired, the sound of the shot echoing through the trees. The bullet struck the creature in the chest, and for a moment I thought it was over. But then it kept coming, seemingly unfazed by the wound, its movements faster now, more erratic. I fired again and again, each shot hitting its mark, but the creature just kept coming, its mouth opening wider, revealing more of those terrible teeth. It was almost on top of me when I finally hit something vital. The creature let out a terrible screech and staggered back, its body convulsing as it collapsed to the ground. I didn't stick around to see if it was dead. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the main trail, the fog beginning to lift as the sun finally broke through the clouds. When I finally made it back to town, I told the local ranger what I'd seen. He looked at me like I was crazy, but when I took him back to the clearing, the creature was still there, its body twisted and broken on the ground. They never figured out what it was, though they tried to pass it off as some kind of mutated animal, maybe a bear with a deformity or a disease. But I know better. I've seen a lot of strange things in my time, but nothing like that, and I hope I never do again. As for me, I packed up my gear and left the Alleghenies behind. There are plenty of other places to hike, places where the land doesn't feel like it's watching you, waiting for something to happen. But every now and then, I find myself thinking about that clearing, wondering if there's more out there, hidden in the fog, waiting to be found. I was never the kind of man who believed in superstition or the supernatural. Life had enough real problems without worrying about things that go bump in the night. My name is Sam Rickman, and I've spent the better part of my life as a park ranger in Washington State. My job was simple: keep the trails safe, ensure the tourists don't wander too far, and enjoy the serenity that came with the wilderness. I suppose you could say I was one of the lucky ones, making a living doing something I loved. But what happened last year, in the summer of 1987, shattered my simple understanding of the world. The Cascades were especially beautiful that time of year, with the pine trees standing tall and proud, their green needles vibrant against the clear blue sky. The trails were bustling with hikers, families enjoying picnics, and the occasional loner seeking solace in the embrace of nature. My daily routine involved patrolling the more popular paths, making sure everything was in order. It was on one of these patrols that I first encountered Paul Harkins, a man who would change the course of my life. Paul was a hiker like any other at first glance, tall, wiry, with a mop of unruly brown hair and a scruffy beard that suggested he spent more time in the wild than out of it. He was dressed in the usual gear: sturdy boots, cargo pants, and a weathered backpack slung over one shoulder. But what caught my attention was the look in his eyes, something between fear and determination. "Hey, Ranger," Paul had called out as I passed him on the trail. "You got a minute?" I stopped, adjusting my hat and giving him a nod. "Sure thing. What can I do for you?" Paul shifted his weight from one foot to the other, glancing over his shoulder before speaking. "Have you heard of anything strange around here? Like people going missing or odd animal sightings?" I frowned, the question catching me off guard. "Not really. We get the usual bear and cougar sightings, but nothing out of the ordinary." "Why do you ask?" He hesitated, then sighed. "My friend Mike, he was hiking with me a couple of days ago. We were up by the old fire lookout, you know, the one that's been closed off for years. We figured we'd camp nearby, do some exploring." "That lookout is off limits for a reason," I said, my voice firm. "The area isn't safe." "Yeah, we know that now," Paul replied, rubbing the back of his neck. "But it's not the terrain that got him. We were hiking back down when we heard something big. At first we thought it was just a deer or maybe a bear, but then it started making this noise, like a rumble, almost like a roar, but not quite." I crossed my arms, my interest piqued. "Go on." Paul swallowed, his eyes darting around as if he expected whatever it was to appear at any moment. "It sounded wrong. Unnatural. Mike and I started running, but he tripped, fell behind. I turned back to help him, but by the time I reached him, he was gone. And I swear, Ranger, I saw something dragging him into the trees. It wasn't a bear or anything I've ever seen before. It was bigger, almost humanoid, but with the head of a wolf or something. I don't know how to describe it. I stared at him, my mind racing to process what he was saying. "Did you report this?" "Yeah," Paul nodded, "but the local sheriff just wrote it off as a bear attack. Said Mike probably panicked and ran off into the woods. They didn't find a body, just some torn clothing and a lot of blood." I didn't want to believe him, but there was something about the way he told the story that unsettled me. It wasn't just the fear in his eyes, it was the desperation, the need to be believed. After a moment, I sighed. "All right, I'll check it out, but if it's a bear, you need to stay out of its territory." Paul gave me a grateful look, but it was clear he didn't believe it was a bear any more than I did. "Thanks, Ranger. Just be careful, okay?" The conversation stuck with me as I made my way back to the station. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying Paul's words, the fear in his voice, and the vivid description of what he claimed to have seen. I wasn't one for ghost stories or myths, but something about this felt different. I decided I'd head up to the old fire lookout the next day, just to ease my mind. The following morning, I packed my gear and set out early, hoping to cover as much ground as possible before dark. The trail to the lookout was rough, overgrown from years of neglect. The forest was dense, the trees crowding in on all sides, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into a dim greenish glow. It was quiet, too quiet even for the wilderness. The usual sounds of birds and small animals were absent, leaving only the rustle of leaves and the crunch of twigs underfoot. As I neared the old fire lookout, I noticed the air felt different, heavy, almost oppressive. The structure itself was dilapidated, the wood rotting and the windows shattered. I circled the area, looking for any signs of what might have happened to Paul's friend, but all I found were scattered pieces of torn fabric and a broken flashlight. I was about to head back when I heard it. The sound Paul had described. It wasn't quite a roar, but it was low and resonant, vibrating through the ground and up into my bones. My heart raced as I turned, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Then I saw it. It was huge, easily 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long, powerful limbs. Its skin was rough and mottled, like the bark of a tree, and its head. Its head was indeed that of a wolf, but larger, more feral, with a gaping maw filled with jagged teeth. It moved on 2 legs, but hunched over as it crept through the trees, its eyes, cold and calculating, fixed on me. I froze, my hand instinctively reaching for the revolver at my side. The creature tilted its head, almost as if it were studying me, deciding whether I was prey or a threat. My fingers trembled as I drew the gun, aiming it squarely at the beast's chest. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then with a sudden burst of speed, the creature lunged at me, its claws outstretched. I fired, the sound of the gunshot echoing through the trees. The bullet struck home, but the creature barely flinched. It was on me in an instant, its massive hand swatting the gun from my grasp and sending me crashing to the ground. I scrambled backward, my mind racing as I tried to think of a way out. The creature loomed over me, its hot breath washing over my face, filling my nostrils with the stench of decay. It raised one clawed hand, ready to strike, when a sharp whistle cut through the air. The creature hesitated, its head snapping toward the sound. I seized the opportunity, grabbing a nearby rock and slamming it into the side of its head with all the strength I could muster. The beast roared, no, not quite a roar, but something close, and stumbled backward, giving me just enough time to get to my feet. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I ran, crashing through the underbrush, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I put as much distance between myself and the creature as possible. I could hear it crashing through the trees behind me, but it seemed slower, less focused. Finally, I broke through the tree line and into a clearing, where a group of hikers stood frozen, their eyes wide with fear. They must have heard the commotion, maybe even seen the creature, though I doubt they would believe their own eyes. Without a word, we all turned and ran, not stopping until we reached the relative safety of the main trail. When I finally dared to look back, the creature was gone. But the memory of it, the sight, the smell, the sound, would stay with me forever. The authorities dismissed the incident, just as they had with Paul's story, but I knew the truth. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't a bear, and it wasn't a man. It was something else, something old and dangerous, and it was still out there, somewhere in the depths of the Cascades. I never saw Paul again after that day. I don't know if he went back looking for his friend or if he decided it was better to leave the past behind. As for me, I stayed on as a ranger, but I never ventured back to the old fire lookout. Some places are best left alone, especially when you don't understand what lives there. I didn't go back to that trail, and no one else should either. They say the trails near Coyote Gulch are some of the most beautiful and untouched in the Southwest, a hidden gem for those who seek solitude and connection with nature. My name is Brennan Cawthorne, and I've spent most of my life chasing those wild places, where the land feels ancient and the air carries the whispers of forgotten times. After a few years working as a park ranger in Utah, I thought I had seen everything the backcountry had to offer, but last month I found out how wrong I was. That morning, I packed light, just the essentials. A tent, sleeping bag, a few days' worth of food, and my trusty hiking boots worn in from hundreds of miles. I was meeting up with my old college friend, Leo Escobar, who was driving in from Denver. We hadn't seen each other in years, but we'd always promised to reconnect on a hiking trip, and Coyote Gulch seemed like the perfect spot. Remote, challenging, and far from any cell service. A place where we could forget about the world and lose ourselves in the wilderness. The plan was simple, a 2-day hike through the gulch, following the narrow canyon as it twisted and turned through towering red rock walls, eventually leading us to the natural bridge where we'd camp for the night. From there, we'd loop back around, taking a different route to avoid retracing our steps. Nothing complicated, just two friends on an adventure, like the old days. Leo was late, as usual. He showed up about an hour past our agreed time, blaming Denver traffic and some last-minute errands. I laughed it off. Some things never change. After a quick catch-up and a few swigs of water, we hit the trail. The first day was uneventful, which was exactly what we wanted. We hiked in silence for the most part. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel underfoot and the occasional rustle of wind through the brush. The walls of the canyon loomed over us, casting long shadows that made the air cool despite the sun high overhead. We stopped for lunch by a shallow stream, and the conversation flowed as easily as it used to in the dorms, though now we spoke of careers, families, and the ways life had tugged us in different directions. By the time we reached the natural bridge, the sun was beginning its descent, painting the rocks in hues of orange and red. We set up camp under the arch, a perfect shelter from the elements. After dinner, simple stuff, just some freeze-dried meals and coffee, we sat around the small fire we'd built, sharing stories from our pasts and making plans for the future. The stars were out in force, twinkling in the clear night sky like they could only in places untouched by city lights. It was sometime after midnight when I heard the first noise, a distant, echoing sound that made me sit up in my sleeping bag. It was hard to pinpoint. Maybe 100 yards away, maybe a mile. A low, resonant thud, followed by what I thought might be a scraping sound, like stone against stone. I listened for a while, but when the sound didn't repeat, I convinced myself it was just the natural settling of rocks, or maybe a boulder shifting somewhere in the canyon. I glanced over at Leo, who was snoring softly, and decided not to wake him. It was probably nothing. The next morning, Leo and I packed up and continued our hike. The trail led us deeper into the canyon, the walls closing in tighter, making the path narrower and more difficult to navigate. We had to climb over fallen boulders and wade through pools of stagnant water, but nothing we couldn't handle. We were both experienced hikers after all. But as we ventured further, that uneasy feeling from the night before began to grow. The canyon felt different somehow, like it was watching us. I know how that sounds, but there's no other way to describe it. The air was thicker, the silence heavier. Even Leo, who had always been the more carefree of the two of us, seemed on edge. We talked less, focused more on the trail ahead. It was around midday when we stumbled upon the cave. I almost missed it, hidden as it was behind a cluster of jagged rocks, the entrance narrow and dark. There was something about it that drew us in, a curiosity that neither of us could ignore. Without a word, we agreed to take a closer look. The cave was deeper than I expected. The walls smooth and cool to the touch, almost like they'd been carved out deliberately. Our flashlights barely cut through the darkness, illuminating only a few feet ahead. The air inside was stale, with a faint metallic scent that made me uneasy. But what caught my attention were the scratches on the walls. Deep, parallel grooves, as if something with claws had dragged itself through the rock. I ran my fingers along one of the marks, feeling the rough edges. It was recent, maybe days old. "Brandon, you seeing this?" Leo's voice echoed off the walls, low and cautious. "Yeah, looks like a bear or something. We should get out of here." But Leo shook his head. "Those marks, they're too deep. Bears don't do this. Whatever it was big." I didn't argue. I didn't want to think about what could make scratches like that. We backed out of the cave slowly, every sense on high alert. Once outside, the daylight felt like a blessing, but the sense of being watched hadn't left me. "Let's move on," I said. "We'll make better time if we keep going." Leo nodded, and we pressed forward, but something had changed. The canyon didn't feel like the same place we had entered. The walls seemed closer, the shadows darker. Every little sound, whether it was the crunch of gravel, the whisper of wind, or the distant call of a bird, felt amplified, ominous. The trail took us into a narrower section of the canyon, the walls on either side towering like monoliths. There was no way to climb out, no easy escape. And then we heard it again. That thudding noise, much closer now, followed by the scraping of stone. My heart raced as I scanned the canyon, but there was nothing, just the oppressive silence that followed. "Leo, we need to go back," I whispered. But before he could respond, something moved ahead of us. A shadow, large and low to the ground, darted across the path, disappearing behind a boulder. It was fast, too fast for either of us to react. "What the hell was that?" Leo whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know, but we're not sticking around to find out. Back the way we came now." We turned to retreat, but as we did, the same shadow appeared behind us, blocking the path. My breath caught in my throat. It was huge, its form low and hulking, like a mountain lion, but much larger, more massive. It moved with a predatory grace, its muscles rippling under coarse fur that looked almost like the bark of a tree, rough and gnarled. I could see the outline of claws, long and curved, dragging across the ground as it advanced. Leo panicked. He turned to run, but the creature was faster. It lunged forward, swiping at him with one of those massive claws. Leo's scream echoed through the canyon as he was knocked to the ground, blood splattering across the rocks. "Leo!" I shouted, but there was nothing I could do. The creature was on him, tearing into his body with a ferocity that made my stomach churn. I scrambled backward, my mind racing. I needed a weapon, anything to fight back. But all I had was my hiking stick, a useless piece of wood against the beast in front of me. Then, in a desperate moment of clarity, I remembered the flare gun in my pack. I dropped to my knees, tearing through my bag, my hands shaking as I pulled it out. The creature hadn't noticed me yet, too focused on its prey. I loaded the flare, aimed at the monster's back, and fired. The flare shot out with a loud pop, striking the creature's back and exploding into a brilliant burst of red light. It howled, a deep, rumbling sound that reverberated through the canyon walls, then reared up on its hind legs, the light searing into its flesh. For the first time I saw its face, if you could call it that. A twisted, contorted mass of flesh and bone, with a mouth too wide and full of teeth that didn't seem to belong. It turned towards me, its eyes empty, soulless, fixing on me with a hatred that I could feel deep in my bones. But the flare did its job. The creature stumbled, its movements frantic as it tried to extinguish the burning light embedded in its back. I took my chance and ran, not looking back, just running as fast as I could, the canyon blurring around me. I ran for what felt like hours, my lungs burning, legs numb, until I finally burst out of the canyon into the open desert. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, the sun warm against my skin. I had escaped. By the time the authorities arrived, I was barely coherent, babbling about the creature and the cave. They found Leo's body where I'd left him, torn apart, his blood staining the rocks. The canyon was closed off, and an investigation was launched, but nothing was ever found. No sign of the creature, no tracks, nothing. just Leo's body and the deep scratches in the cave. But I know what I saw. It was real. It was a mistake to take the shortcut through the woods. I had heard the stories, of course, but I wasn't the superstitious type. I'm Martin Zielinski, a forest ranger in Oregon, and I've spent most of my life navigating through dense forests and rugged terrains. If there's one thing I've learned over the years, it's that people love to embellish, especially when it comes to the unexplained. So when my buddy Greg suggested we take the old trail through the Blackwater Forest to shave off some time from our camping trip, I agreed without a second thought. We were 2 days into the hike, deep in the heart of the forest. The trees here were unlike anything else in the Pacific Northwest, towering ancient redwoods with trunks as wide as small houses. The undergrowth was thick and the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The only sounds were the crunch of our boots on the forest floor and the occasional chirp of a bird or rustle in the bushes. Greg was the type who loved a good scare. He'd always try to spook me with tales of lost hikers, mysterious disappearances, and strange creatures lurking in the shadows. I'd laugh it off, calling him out on his nonsense, but this place, it felt different. It wasn't something I could put my finger on, just an uneasy feeling that settled in my gut like a bad meal. We had made camp by a small, stagnant pond, the water black as ink. The sun was dipping below the treetops, casting long, dark shadows that crept towards us. We'd set up our tents, built a small fire, and were preparing dinner, simple canned beans and sausages, when Greg started up again with his stories. "Ever hear about the Blackwater beast?" he asked, poking at the fire with a stick. "Can't say I have," I replied, focusing on stirring the beans in the pot. I wasn't in the mood for his games tonight. "They say it's something like a bear, but different, bigger, meaner. Some folks claim it's not even an animal at all, more like a demon or spirit. Something ancient that's lived in these woods since before man walked on 2 legs." "Uh-huh," I said, trying to sound disinterested. "Come on, man. Don't you ever wonder why so many people disappear out here? This isn't just a regular forest, you know. This place is cursed." "Yeah, and so are you if you keep talking like that," I joked, though I could feel a chill running up my spine. It wasn't the cold. Something about this place was starting to get under my skin. We finished eating in silence, the fire crackling softly as the darkness closed in around us. Greg was still grinning like a fool, clearly pleased with himself for unsettling me, but I was too tired to care. I crawled into my tent, zipped up the flap, and tried to shake off the weird feeling that had settled over me. The forest was silent, too silent. No crickets, no owls, nothing. It was as if the whole world had gone to sleep, leaving just Greg and me alone in the dark. I lay there staring at the tent ceiling, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But the silence was deafening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there watching us. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard it. A low, rumbling noise that reverberated through the ground and up into my bones. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before. Deep, powerful, and unnatural. I shot up in my sleeping bag, heart pounding, and listened. The noise came again, closer this time. It was followed by a series of heavy footsteps, the kind that made the earth tremble. "Greg," I called out softly, but there was no answer. I unzipped the tent and peered out. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow over the campsite. Greg's tent was still closed, but I couldn't see him through the small mesh window. Then I saw it. It stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the trees. It was massive, easily twice the size of a grizzly, with matted fur that hung in clumps from its muscular frame. Its face was more wolf-like than bear, with a long snout and rows of sharp teeth that gleamed in the firelight. But its eyes, I didn't see them, but I could feel them locked onto me, burning with a malevolent intelligence that sent a wave of terror through my entire body. The creature took a step forward, and the ground shook beneath its weight. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if I was rooted to the spot, helpless and vulnerable. The thing snarled, a sound that seemed to echo through the trees, and I knew without a doubt that it was going to kill me. But then, Greg's tent exploded open, and he charged out, rifle in hand. He didn't hesitate, didn't stop to think. He just fired. The crack of the gunshot shattered the silence, and the creature roared, a horrible, bone-chilling sound. It turned its gaze on Greg, and for a moment, I thought it would tear him apart. But instead it took a step back, then another, before disappearing into the shadows of the forest. Greg was breathing hard, his face pale as a ghost. He didn't say a word, just stared at the spot where the creature had been. I scrambled out of my tent, grabbing my own rifle, and stood beside him, my heart racing. "What the hell was that?" I finally managed to ask, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. I don't know, Greg admitted, his voice shaking. But whatever it is, it's not natural. We stayed up the rest of the night, rifles at the ready, but the creature didn't return. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we packed up and left, not daring to look back. The hike out of the forest was grueling. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves made us jump. But we made it back to civilization without incident, our nerves frayed but intact. We reported what we'd seen to the authorities, but they didn't believe us. Chalked it up to overactive imaginations or maybe some kind of bear we hadn't recognized. But I know what we saw. I know what's out there. And I'll never set foot in Blackwater Forest again. Greg and I parted ways after that trip. We still keep in touch, but we don't talk about what happened. There's no point. People wouldn't believe us even if we did, and besides, some things are better left buried in the past. That's why I'm telling you this now, over a cold beer and a warm fire. Not because I want you to believe me, but because I need to get it off my chest. I've seen a lot of strange things in my time as a ranger, but nothing like that. And I hope to God I never do again. But if you ever find yourself in the Blackwater Forest, remember this. Stay on the main trail and never ever take the shortcut. Because there's something out there, something that's been here long before us, and it doesn't like trespassers. My name's Ernest Clancy, and if you'd asked me yesterday, I'd have told you my life was pretty simple. Born and raised in a quiet town in northern Maine, I've always been the type to keep my head down, work hard, and find my peace out in the wilderness. I'm a contractor by trade, one of those guys who can fix up your roof, rewire your house, or build a deck from scratch. I like to think I'm a man of practical skills, a guy who can figure out solutions to most problems with a little elbow grease and some common sense. But today, things are different. I'm sitting here in the police station, hands still shaking from what I just went through. It all started early this morning when I decided to take a break from work and go on a solo hike. I needed some time to clear my head, away from the noise of the world. I headed out to Moosehead Lake, where the trails are dense with pine trees. The air is fresh, and the only sounds you hear are the birds and the rustle of leaves. The lake has always been my refuge. There's a certain kind of silence there that I've never found anywhere else, a silence that lets you hear yourself think. I've been hiking these woods since I was a kid, so I know them like the back of my hand. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. The first few hours of the hike were uneventful, just the way I like it. I followed the trail up into the hills, where the terrain gets rockier and the trees grow thicker. The path wound around the lake, offering stunning views of the water glistening in the morning light. I was planning to camp out for the night, so I had my gear with me, tent, sleeping bag, a couple of MREs, and my old hunting knife strapped to my belt. I didn't bring a gun because, well, I didn't think I'd need one. This area's never had much in the way of dangerous wildlife, and besides, I've never been much of a hunter. My knife's been more than enough for the odd bushcraft task or to ward off a curious coyote. It was around midday when I decided to veer off the main trail. There's a spot I like that's a little harder to get to, but it's worth it for the seclusion. You have to scramble over some rocks and duck under low-hanging branches, but once you get there, you're rewarded with a small clearing right on the edge of the lake. It's the perfect place to set up camp. I just finished pitching my tent and was sitting on a log munching on a granola bar when I noticed something strange. The woods had gone quiet. Too quiet. The usual sounds of birds and insects had completely stopped, leaving a heavy silence that settled over the clearing like a blanket. I've spent enough time outdoors to know that when the woods go silent, it usually means something's up. I stood up, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. At first, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, just the dense thicket of trees, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze. But then, I caught sight of something moving in the underbrush, about 50 yards away. It was low to the ground, slinking through the shadows, and at first I thought it might be a deer or maybe a bobcat. But as it drew closer, I realized it was something else entirely. The creature was massive, at least the size of a grizzly, but with a leaner, more sinewy build. Its skin was mottled and rough, like the bark of an old tree, and it moved with an unnatural grace, its limbs long and spindly. The way it slunk through the woods reminded me of a giant salamander, but with the raw power of a predator. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. This wasn't some known animal. This was something different, something that didn't belong in these woods, or anywhere for that matter. My instincts told me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the creature as it crept closer, its head low to the ground, sniffing the air like it was hunting. Then it stopped. Its head snapped up, and it looked directly at me, or at least I think it did. I couldn't see any eyes, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unrelenting. My mind raced. I had my knife, but what good would that do against something like this? I could try to make a break for it, but I knew there was no way I'd outrun it, not through this terrain. Just as I was about to turn and run anyway, the creature let out a low, rumbling noise, a sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It wasn't a roar, more like a deep, vibrating hum that seemed to resonate through the ground itself. And then, before I could react, it charged. The speed was terrifying. 1 second it was standing still, the next it was barreling toward me with all the force of a freight train. I barely had time to draw my knife before it was on me. I slashed wildly, more out of desperation than anything else, and by some miracle I managed to land a hit. The blade sunk into its flesh with a sickening squelch, and the creature let out a piercing screech that echoed through the trees. But it didn't stop. The thing was relentless, clawing at me with long, jagged appendages, its skin tough and leathery like some prehistoric beast. I kept slashing, adrenaline fueling my every move, but it was like fighting a nightmare, something beyond the realm of reality. I don't know how long the struggle lasted. It felt like an eternity, every second stretching out as I fought for my life. At one point I managed to drive the knife deep into what I guessed was its torso, and the creature recoiled, thrashing violently. I was thrown back against a tree, the impact knocking the wind out of me, and for a moment everything went black. When I came to, the creature was lying on the ground, motionless. I was covered in blood, its blood thick and dark, with a foul, acrid stench that made my stomach churn. I staggered to my feet, half expecting it to get back up and finish the job, but it didn't move. It was dead. I didn't wait around to see if it had any friends. I grabbed my gear, leaving the tent behind, and made a beeline for the trail. My body was bruised and battered, and every step sent waves of pain through me, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of those woods. I don't remember much of the hike back. It was all a blur. Trees, rocks, the trail winding endlessly through the forest. By the time I reached my truck, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. I climbed in, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys, and drove straight to the nearest town where I found the police station. And now, here I am, trying to explain what happened to a couple of cops who clearly think I'm out of my mind. They're asking all the usual questions. Had I been drinking? Did I see any tracks? Do I have any pictures? But I know what I saw, and I know that the thing I killed is still out there, lying in the woods by the lake. The blood on my clothes is proof enough, and I tell the cops they can find the body if they want. I'm not going back out there. They seem to believe me, or at least they're willing to check it out. A couple of them are already gearing up to head to the lake. I wish them luck. As for me, I'm done with these woods. Whatever that thing was, it didn't belong here. And now that it's dead, I'm just glad to be alive. I'll stick to fixing roofs and building decks from now on, thank you very much. No more solo hikes for me. I can hear the cops talking, planning their approach. One of them asks if I'll come along to show them the spot. I shake my head. They'll find it easily enough. Just follow the trail, take the first left, and look for the clearing by the lake. They'll see the blood, the body, everything. I'm done. The Adirondack High Peaks region is where I go to escape the noise, the grind of a life that's never quite gone as planned. I work in IT, stuck behind a desk most days, troubleshooting other people's problems, but out here, it's different. Out here, I can breathe. My name is Reed Merrick, and this is my story. This time I wasn't alone. I had invited my friend Nolan Sherwood, a former Marine turned outdoor enthusiast. We planned a 5-day trek deep into the wilderness, an area known for its rugged beauty, but also for being treacherous if you weren't careful. The plan was simple. Hike during the day, set up camp before dusk, and enjoy the quiet peace that only nature can provide. We started off on a Wednesday morning, the sun still low in the sky, casting long shadows over the trail. The air was crisp, the kind that fills your lungs and makes you feel alive. Nolan was in high spirits, cracking jokes about how the only thing we needed to worry about was running out of beer. We had brought a few cans, a luxury item for the first night. The first day was uneventful, just miles of trail and the occasional sound of a distant bird. By evening, we found a clearing by a stream, an ideal spot to pitch our tents. We gathered wood, built a small fire, and sat in the dim light, sipping our beer and talking about everything from work to women. I tell you, Reed, this is the life, Nolan said, leaning back against a rock. Out here, none of the crap back home matters. I nodded, feeling the same. The city felt a million miles away, and for once I wasn't anxious about emails or deadlines. The first sign of trouble came that night. I woke up to the sound of something moving just outside my tent. It wasn't the rustle of wind or the snap of a twig, a deliberate sound like something heavy was shifting its weight. I lay still, listening, hoping it was just a deer or a raccoon scavenging for food. But then I heard it again, a deep, rhythmic breathing. My heart began to pound, and I slowly unzipped my tent, peering out into the darkness. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint red glow. I saw nothing, just the dark silhouettes of trees. Nolan, I whispered, hoping he was awake. There was no response. I crawled out of my tent, the cold air biting at my skin. I moved quietly towards Nolan's tent, which was about 10 feet away. As I reached it, I heard the breathing again, but it wasn't coming from the tent. It was coming from the forest beyond. I froze, trying to pinpoint the source. That's when I saw the eyes, 2 pinpoints of light reflecting from the embers. They were low to the ground, too low for a person, and they were fixed on me. My mouth went dry as I slowly reached for the knife on my belt. The thing didn't move, it just watched, its breath heavy and labored. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it slunk back into the trees, disappearing into the blackness. I stood there, knife in hand, not sure what to do. I could hear my own breath, ragged and shaky. Finally, I gathered the courage to wake Nolan. "Nolan, wake up," I hissed, shaking his tent. He stirred and unzipped his door, squinting at me in the dark. "What the hell, Reed?" he muttered, annoyed. "Something's out there," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He groaned and sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Probably just a bear or something. Go back to sleep." "No," I insisted. "It wasn't a bear. It was... I don't know what it was, but it was watching me." Nolan sighed, but he must have heard the fear in my voice because he grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the tent. We scanned the tree line, but whatever it was gone now. "See? Nothing," Nolan said, still half asleep. "Let's get some rest." Reluctantly, I crawled back into my tent, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing the breathing, the way it had matched the rhythm of my own fear. The next day, we continued our hike, though I was on edge. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see those eyes again, but the daylight brought no sign of danger. Nolan tried to reassure me, saying it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. That evening, we set up camp earlier than usual, near a small lake surrounded by dense forest. The unease from the previous night lingered, but we were both too tired to dwell on it. After dinner, we sat by the fire, not talking much, just listening to the sounds of the night. Then, around midnight, the silence was shattered by a scream. It wasn't a human scream. It was something else, something primal and terrifying. The sound echoed through the trees, sending a chill down my spine. Nolan and I both shot up, grabbing our knives. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his face pale in the firelight. "I don't know," I replied, my voice trembling. "But it's close." We stood there listening, but the scream didn't come again. Instead, we heard the same heavy breathing I had heard the night before. This time, it was closer, much closer. Nolan motioned for me to follow him as he cautiously moved towards the sound. We didn't get far before we saw it. Standing at the edge of the firelight was a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was hunched over, its body covered in matted fur. Its limbs were long and gangly, ending in sharp clawed hands. The most terrifying part was its face. It looked almost human, but twisted and distorted, like a mask pulled too tight over a skull. It let out another scream, this one directed at us, and I felt my legs go weak. Nolan raised his knife, but the thing moved faster than I could comprehend. It lunged at him, knocking him to the ground. "Nolan!" I shouted, rushing forward, but the creature was on top of him, its claws sinking into his flesh. He screamed, a sound that will haunt me forever as the creature tore into him. I swung my knife wildly, slashing at the creature, but it was like trying to cut through stone. The blade barely made a mark. I was shoved back, falling hard onto the ground. Nolan's scream stopped suddenly, replaced by a wet, gurgling noise that turned my stomach. Desperation fueled me as I scrambled to my feet, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My hand closed around a heavy branch, and I swung it with all my strength, hitting the creature across the back. It let out a grunt, more of annoyance than pain, but it was enough to get its attention. It turned towards me, blood dripping from its maw, and I knew in that moment I was going to die. But then, out of nowhere, there was a flash of light, bright enough to blind me. I blinked, disoriented, and when my vision cleared, the creature was gone. The forest was silent again, as if nothing had happened. I staggered over to where Nolan lay. He wasn't moving. His body was mangled, unrecognizable, but there was no doubt he was dead. The sight made me retch, and I fell to my knees, shaking uncontrollably. I don't know how long I sat there before I heard voices. Human voices. A group of hikers had seen the light from our fire and come to investigate. They found me there, covered in blood, and helped me back to the trailhead. I told them what happened, but I don't think they believed me, not fully. They saw Nolan's body, though, and that was enough to convince them that something terrible had happened. They reported it to the authorities, and an investigation was launched, but they never found any trace of the creature. I haven't been back to the Adirondacks since. They say it was a bear attack, that I must have been delirious from shock, but I know what I saw. That thing, whatever it was, it's still out there, but I'm done with the woods. My life is back in the city, where the dangers are more predictable, more manageable. I still miss the mountains, the freedom of the wild, but some things aren't worth the risk. And I don't need to prove anything to anyone. I know what happened, and that's enough for me. The wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth as I trudged up the steep trail, my boots digging into the soft ground. My name is Graham Novak, and I'm no stranger to the wilderness. I've spent more weekends in the woods than in my apartment, which is just the way I like it. This time I decided to explore the Adirondacks, specifically a remote section near Black River Wild Forest that I hadn't touched before, a perfect place to escape the chaos of city life. I wasn't alone on this trip. My buddy, Jasper Tillman, a wiry guy with a knack for survival skills and a sharp tongue, had agreed to tag along. Jasper was the kind of friend who always kept things interesting, whether through his sarcastic commentary or his refusal to let me make stupid decisions without calling me out first. We'd been on countless hikes together, each more challenging than the last, but something about this trek felt different. We planned to camp out near one of the less traveled lakes, a spot we'd found on an old dog-eared map Jasper had acquired from a local outdoorsman. The map's faded lines hinted at trails long forgotten by most hikers, a perfect invitation for us. The trek to the lake was tougher than expected. The trail, if you could even call it that, was overgrown and littered with fallen branches. We had to navigate using landmarks and our instincts. By the time we reached the lake, the sun was dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the still water. The lake itself was eerie in its serenity, a mirror reflecting the dense forest that surrounded it. The silence was profound, interrupted only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant cry of a bird. It was the kind of quiet that pressed down on you, making you aware of every breath you took. We set up camp on a flat patch of ground near the shore, our small tent dwarfed by the towering pines. After dinner, we sat by the fire, the flames licking the cool night air. Jasper was in the middle of one of his rants about modern conveniences ruining the art of camping when we heard it. A low, almost imperceptible hum. It wasn't the sound itself that was unsettling, but the way it seemed to reverberate through the air, making the hairs on my arms stand on end. "You hear that?" I asked, cutting Jasper off mid-sentence. He paused, listening. "Yeah, I hear it. Probably just some distant machinery. There's an old logging site a few miles away." I nodded, but something about the sound nagged at me. It didn't fit. The night was too still, too isolated for there to be machinery nearby. But I didn't push it. We were in the middle of nowhere. Who knew what kind of strange noises the wilderness could conjure? The hum eventually faded, leaving us in silence once more. We turned in early, both exhausted from the day's hike. The tent felt almost claustrophobic as I crawled into my sleeping bag, the weight of the forest pressing down from all sides. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of something moving outside the tent. It wasn't the usual rustle of leaves or the snap of a twig. It was deliberate, methodical, like someone or something was circling our campsite. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for my flashlight. I clicked it on and nudged Jasper awake. "Jazz, you hear that?" He groaned and rolled over, squinting at the light. "What time is it?" "Doesn't matter. Listen." He frowned, sitting up and cocking his head to the side. The noise had stopped, but the silence that followed was even more unnerving. We both knew the woods well enough to recognize when something was off. "Stay here," I whispered, grabbing the hatchet I'd brought along. I unzipped the tent slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible, and slipped outside. The night was pitch black, the moon obscured by thick clouds. I swung the flashlight beam around the campsite, illuminating the trees and the lake beyond. Nothing. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow over the ground. I took a step forward, scanning the perimeter. That's when I saw it. Just at the edge of the light, something crouched low to the ground. It was hard to make out, but the shape was wrong, too angular, too elongated to be any animal I'd ever seen. My breath caught in my throat as the thing lifted its head and stared directly at me. It was grotesque, like a twisted hybrid of a man and an insect. Its body was covered in a chitinous shell, segmented like a beetle's, but its limbs were long and spindly, ending in sharp, claw-like appendages. The head was the worst part, a bulbous mass with no discernible features, just a smooth black surface that absorbed the light rather than reflected it. I froze, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. It wasn't fear that gripped me in that moment. It was disbelief. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't exist. The creature tilted its head, almost as if it were curious, and then it began to move toward me. Slow, deliberate steps that crunched the underbrush beneath it. I raised the hatchet, my hand trembling, but I knew there was no way I could fight this thing off. It was too fast, too alien. Jasper burst out of the tent behind me, his flashlight sweeping across the scene. The beam landed on the creature, and for a split second it recoiled, its limbs jerking back as if the light burned it. Jasper didn't hesitate. He grabbed a burning stick from the fire and hurled it at the thing. The creature let out a shriek, a high-pitched keening sound that pierced the night, and bolted into the trees, moving with a speed and agility that defied its size. We watched it disappear into the darkness, the forest swallowing the noise until we were left with nothing but the crackle of the fire. "What the hell was that?" Jasper gasped, his face pale and eyes wide. "I don't know," I replied, my voice shaking. "But we're getting out of here. Now." We packed up in record time, not bothering to fold the tent or extinguish the fire properly. Our only thought was to put as much distance between us and that creature as possible. We half ran, half stumbled down the trail, the beam of our flashlights bobbing wildly in the dark. As we hurried through the forest, the same hum from earlier returned, growing louder with each passing minute. It wasn't coming from one direction. It seemed to surround us, reverberating through the trees. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, but nothing fit. Nothing made sense anymore. We kept moving, driven by adrenaline and the primal need to survive. The hum grew deafening, and then just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. We stumbled into a clearing, gasping for breath, and I realized with a sinking heart that we were lost. Jasper looked around frantically, trying to get his bearings. "This isn't right. We should have hit the main trail by now." "Maybe we missed it," I said, though I knew it wasn't true. We'd been following the map even in our panic, but the forest seemed to have shifted, the familiar landmarks gone, replaced by unfamiliar terrain. Then I saw them, glowing shapes in the distance just at the edge of the clearing. At first I thought they were eyes, but as they moved closer, I realized there were more of those creatures, their bodies glowing faintly in the darkness. "There's more of them," Jasper whispered, his voice barely audible. Panic surged through me, but I forced it down. "We can't outrun them. We have to fight." "Fight? With what?" Jasper's voice was tinged with hysteria. I looked around, spotting a large, jagged rock on the ground. I picked it up, hefting its weight in my hand. "Whatever we can find." The creatures began to close in, their movements unnervingly coordinated. They surrounded us, forming a loose circle, their faint glow casting eerie shadows on the ground. I tightened my grip on the rock, my knuckles white. Just as I was bracing for the inevitable, there was a blinding flash of light. I squeezed my eyes shut, instinctively raising my arm to shield my face. When the light faded, I opened my eyes to find the creatures gone, as if they'd never been there. The clearing was empty, the hum silenced, and the forest had returned to its normal, quiet state. Jasper and I stood there dumbfounded, trying to comprehend what had just happened. It was as if the forest had expelled whatever nightmare had taken root there, leaving us alone once more. Without a word, we turned and continued our trek, this time managing to find the trail and make our way back to civilization. The relief of seeing the familiar trailhead brought tears to my eyes, though I quickly blinked them away. We never spoke about what we saw that night, not even between ourselves. There was no need. The experience had been seared into our minds, too real to be dismissed, too surreal to be explained. And that was it. We made it back to town, packed up and drove home. The proof of what we encountered was left in the scorched earth and the tattered remnants of our camp. Things we never needed to revisit or explain. Some things are better left as they are. My name is Ridley Wexler, and I've always thought of myself as a guy who knows how to keep a cool head. Life in Chicago hasn't been kind, but I've managed to carve out a little space for myself in the chaos. Between the stress of my work as a private investigator and the demands of living in the city, I needed a break. So I decided to head out to the remote forest of the Shawnee National Forest in southern Illinois. I'd heard from an old buddy that the trails there were quiet, the kind of place where you could lose yourself for a while without the buzz of civilization pressing in on you. It was early morning when I arrived at the Garden of the Gods, a place known for its jagged rock formations that rise sharply from the forest floor. The air was crisp, the kind that wakes you up better than any cup of coffee ever could. I strapped on my backpack, took a deep breath of the pine-scented air, and set off down the Indian Point Trail. The plan was simple: hike until I couldn't, then set up camp somewhere off the beaten path. I walked for hours, the trail gradually narrowing as it wound deeper into the forest. The thick canopy above filtered the sunlight, casting everything in a soft green glow. It was peaceful. A few deer crossed my path, their ears twitching as they looked at me, and then darted back into the undergrowth. It felt good to be out here, away from everything. By mid-afternoon, I veered off the trail, drawn by the sound of running water. It didn't take long to find the source, a small, secluded stream winding through a glen. I decided this was the spot. Setting up camp was second nature to me. The tent went up easily, and before long I was sitting by the stream, a small fire crackling beside me. I felt content, more relaxed than I had in months. But as dusk settled, a strange unease began to creep over me. It was subtle at first, just a nagging feeling at the back of my mind, but it grew stronger as the minutes ticked by. The forest, once full of life, seemed to fall unnaturally silent. The only sound was the whisper of the wind through the trees, but even that felt off, like it was carrying something with it, something I couldn't quite place. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to being alone in an unfamiliar place. I've camped solo plenty of times, but there was something different about this forest. Something wrong. As night fell, I huddled closer to the fire, the warmth doing little to ease the chill that had settled into my bones. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a sound, a low, wet crunch. My first thought was a bear, but it didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard before. It was closer, too close. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the perimeter of my campsite. Nothing. But the silence that followed was worse. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. I sat there, every muscle tense, my heart pounding in my chest. The fire crackled softly, the only noise in the oppressive stillness. Then, just as suddenly, the sound came again, this time from the opposite direction. I whipped the flashlight around, and that's when I saw it. Something massive, crouched low among the trees, its shape barely discernible in the shadows. It was hunched over, its back rising and falling in deep rhythmic breaths. The light caught a glimpse of matted fur, slick with something dark and wet. I froze, the beam of my flashlight trembling in my hand. Whatever it was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was big, bigger than any animal that should have been in these woods, and its presence filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. For a moment, neither of us moved. I don't know if it saw me, but it was aware of me. I could feel it. Then, with a sickening lurch, it stood up. It was towering, nearly 7 feet tall, with a frame that seemed too large for the forest around it. The creature's arms were long, unnaturally so, ending in hands that seemed more like claws. Its head was misshapen like a wolf's, but grotesquely distorted. Its jaw slightly unhinged as it drew in a deep, rasping breath. Instinct kicked in. I bolted, abandoning the camp and my gear, not caring about anything except putting as much distance as possible between me and that thing. I ran blindly through the trees, the beam of the flashlight bouncing wildly. Behind me, I could hear it crashing through the underbrush, a heavy, deliberate pursuit. I knew these woods were vast, but it felt like they were closing in on me, the trees twisting and warping in the darkness. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop, not until I was sure I'd lost it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I stumbled into a clearing. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. The night was eerily quiet again, but I didn't trust it. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, but it defied logic. There was no explanation, nothing that fit. I knew I couldn't stay here, couldn't risk it finding me again. I got to my feet, legs shaking, and looked around. The clearing was large, but there was no sign of a trail, no indication of where I was or how far I'd come. Panic began to set in, the realization that I was lost in the middle of nowhere, with something hunting me. I had to move, had to keep going. As I made my way through the forest, I could feel its presence, always just out of sight. But there. I didn't dare stop, pushing forward until the first light of dawn began to break through the trees. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. I could see the end of the forest ahead, but as I stepped into the open, I froze. There, in the clearing, was a small wooden cabin. It looked old, abandoned, but there was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl. The windows were broken, the door slightly ajar, and the air around it felt heavy, like the forest itself was pressing down on it. I didn't want to go near it, but I had no choice. I needed to find shelter, some place where I could regroup and figure out what to do next. I approached the cabin cautiously, every step deliberate. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a single room, dark and musty. It was empty, save for an old table and a few chairs, all covered in a thick layer of dust. The walls were scratched, deep gouges that looked like they'd been made by something with claws. I moved to the window, peering out into the forest. Nothing. The creature was gone, or at least it seemed that way. I sank into one of the chairs, my body aching, the events of the night catching up to me. I needed to rest, to think. But as I sat there, something caught my eye. A small, faded photograph on the table, partially hidden under the dust. I picked it up, my heart pounding in my chest. The photo was old, black and white, showing a family, 2 parents and a child, standing in front of this very cabin. But there was something else in the picture, something lurking in the background, just on the edge of the trees. A shadow, tall and menacing, with a shape that was all too familiar. I dropped the photo, my hands shaking. This thing, whatever it was, had been here before, had watched them just as it had watched me, and it was still out there, somewhere in the woods. I had to leave, had to get out of these woods before it found me again. I grabbed a rusted axe that was propped against the wall and stepped outside, determined to make it back to civilization, to survive. I didn't look back. As I walked away from the cabin, the first rays of sunlight cutting through the trees, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone in those woods. And I never would be again. The authorities found my campsite the next day. They didn't believe my story, of course, but they couldn't explain the torn-up tent, the massive footprints, or the scratches that raked across the trees. I didn't care what they thought. I knew what was out there, and that was enough. I don't go hiking anymore. You ever think you know yourself until you're out there in the wilderness alone, miles from any help? I guess I thought I did. My name's Isaac, and if there's one thing I've always prided myself on, it's being able to handle whatever life throws at me. I've been through tough spots, like losing my dad when I was 14 or getting laid off from a job I'd busted my ass at for a decade. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what happened last week up in the Ozark Mountains. I've always loved hiking, the solitude, the peace, the feeling of being a tiny speck in the grand scheme of nature. This time I decided to push a little deeper into the Ozarks, to a spot I'd read about but never seen in person. Devil's Hollow, they call it. Even the name has a kind of heavy weight to it, doesn't it? But names are just names. I wasn't afraid of anything out there. At least, that's what I told myself. It was a Thursday when I set off from the trailhead, the sky an iron gray that promised rain but hadn't delivered yet. The trail was quiet, just the crunch of my boots on the dirt, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. There wasn't another soul around, and that's just how I liked it. After a few hours of hiking, I found a good spot to make camp for the night. A small clearing with a flat spot for my tent and a nearby creek for water. I was sitting by the fire, watching the flames lick the logs, lost in thought when I first heard it. At first, it was just a rustling in the bushes, the kind you'd expect from a small animal, maybe a raccoon or something. But then it came again, louder this time, closer. I stood up, shining my flashlight towards the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, but all I saw were the usual shadows cast by the trees. Probably just a deer, I muttered to myself, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I sat back down, tried to focus on the warmth of the fire, but that uneasy feeling just wouldn't let go. After a while, the sound stopped, and I managed to convince myself it was nothing. The wind in the trees, a rabbit maybe. Eventually, I turned in for the night, zipping myself up in my sleeping bag and closing my eyes. I woke up to the sound of something scraping against the side of my tent. Not the rustling of an animal passing by, but something deliberate, like claws or nails dragging along the fabric. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else, but I forced myself to stay still, to listen. The scraping continued, moving slowly around the tent, a slow circle. It was too dark to see anything through the nylon, but I could feel it, whatever it was, just outside. I reached for the hunting knife I kept by my side, my hand trembling as I gripped the handle. And then, as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. Silence. The kind that makes your ears ring, I waited, knife in hand, not daring to move. Minutes passed, maybe hours, I couldn't tell. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, it was morning. I unzipped the tent slowly, knife still in hand, and peered outside. The camp looked the same as it had the night before, except for one thing. The ground around my tent was disturbed, the dirt and leaves scuffed up in a wide circle, and there in the center of the circle was something that made my blood run cold. A deer's head severed cleanly from the body, its eyes wide open and staring straight at me. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat, and scanned the area. There was no sign of the rest of the deer, no tracks, no blood trail, just the head, placed there like some kind of sick trophy. I grabbed my gear, shoving it into my pack as fast as I could. I didn't know what had done this, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I started back down the trail at a pace that was probably too fast for the terrain. Every little sound, every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. But I didn't see anything. No animals, no people, just the empty forest stretching out in every direction. I must have hiked for hours, the trail twisting and turning. But eventually I realized something wasn't right. The path seemed different, unfamiliar. I should have been heading downhill, but instead I was going up, deeper into the mountains. I stopped, trying to get my bearings, but nothing looked the way it should. That's when I saw it, off to the side of the trail, just barely visible through the trees. A cabin. It was old, abandoned by the looks of it, with the roof half caved in and the walls covered in moss. I didn't want to go near it, but something drew me in, a curiosity I couldn't explain. I approached cautiously, knife in hand, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I didn't. I walked up to the door, which was hanging off its hinges, and pushed it open. The inside was dark, the air thick with the smell of rot and decay. There were old rusted tools on the walls, a broken table in the center of the room, and in the corner, something that made my heart skip a beat. It was a pile of bones, human bones, scattered haphazardly across the floor. They looked old, weathered, but there was no mistaking what they were. My mind raced, trying to piece together what the hell was going on. Who had these belonged to? And what had happened here? That's when I heard it again, the scraping sound, this time coming from the far corner of the cabin. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and saw something that I can only describe as a nightmare made flesh. It was hunched over, its back to me, its skin a sickly gray, covered in patches of matted fur. It was larger than any animal I'd ever seen, but its movements were disturbingly human. It turned slowly and I caught a glimpse of its face. A twisted, grotesque parody of a wolf with a snout too long and teeth that jutted out in jagged angles. But it wasn't just an animal. There was something almost intelligent in its eyes, something that made my blood run cold. I didn't think. I just ran. I bolted out of that cabin and into the forest. The sound of that thing crashing through the underbrush behind me. I don't know how long I ran, or how I managed to find the trail again, but I did. And somehow I made it back to the trailhead, gasping for breath, my heart hammering in my chest. I collapsed near my car, my legs giving out from under me, and for a long time I just sat there, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. But there was no making sense of it. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't something that belonged in this world. The police didn't believe me when I told them what I'd found. They sent a couple of rangers up there to check it out, but they didn't find anything. The cabin was gone, they said, and there were no bones, no tracks, nothing to prove I wasn't just some crazy guy who got lost in the woods. But I know what I saw, and I know that whatever it was, it's still out there, somewhere in those mountains. And maybe, just maybe, someone else will stumble upon it, just like I did. But I hope to God they don't. I packed up my things and left the Ozarks that day, driving straight through the night until I was hundreds of miles away, and as far as I'm concerned, I'm never going back. The year was 1983, and I had just landed a job with the Forest Service, stationed in a remote outpost in the northern woods of Minnesota. It was the kind of place where the air tasted of pine and earth, where the stars filled the night sky so densely that the Milky Way seemed to spill out like a burst of silver. I was alone most of the time, patrolling the vast wilderness, making sure campers were following the rules, and occasionally helping out with search and rescue missions. My name is Ian Haskell. I've always had a bit of wanderlust, the kind that drives a man to seek out places where the roads turn to dirt and the towns fade into the wilderness. The job with the Forest Service seemed perfect for me. A chance to be out in nature, to escape the noise and bustle of the city, and to get lost in the silence of the woods. I'd been at the outpost for about 6 months when the incident happened. It was early autumn, the time of year when the days grow shorter, and the air takes on a biting edge. The tourists were starting to thin out, and the forest was beginning to reclaim its solitude. I was on a routine patrol, hiking through an area known as the Lost Lake Loop, a remote trail that skirted the edge of a small, deep lake hidden among the pines. The Lost Lake Loop was notorious for its difficult terrain and the number of people who had gone missing over the years. Most were found, of course, usually within a day or two, disoriented but otherwise unharmed. But there were a few who had never been found, their disappearances feeding local legends of spirits or wild men who prowled the forest. I wasn't much for ghost stories, but I respected the forest. It had a way of making a man feel small, vulnerable. And it was easy to see how someone could get turned around out there, especially in the low light of dusk when the shadows grew long, and the trees seemed to close in around you. That afternoon I reached the southern end of the lake just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The light was fading fast, and I knew I needed to start heading back, but something caught my eye. A faint trail leading off into the trees, one that wasn't marked on any map. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, overgrown with brush and littered with fallen branches. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow it for a while, just to see where it led. The trail wound deeper into the forest, the trees growing thicker and the underbrush more tangled. I was about to turn back when I noticed something odd. The forest had gone completely silent. No rustle of leaves, no birds calling to one another. Not even the distant hum of insects. Just an oppressive, unnatural quiet. That's when I saw it. A figure standing just ahead on the trail. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long limbs that seemed to stretch out unnaturally. It was covered in a thick, matted fur, like that of a bear, but its shape was all wrong. It stood on 2 legs, its body hunched forward with arms that nearly brushed the ground. The head was the most disturbing part, though. Elongated, almost canine, but twisted, with a jaw that seemed to stretch too wide, full of sharp, uneven teeth. It didn't move, just stood there, staring at me, though I couldn't see its eyes. A primal fear gripped me, the kind that comes from deep within, an ancient instinct that told me I was looking at something not of this world. I took a step back, and the creature mirrored me, moving in a way that was both fluid and jerky, as if it wasn't used to walking on 2 legs. Panic surged through me, and I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, my only thought to put as much distance between me and that thing as possible. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I burst out onto the main trail, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked back, expecting to see the creature barreling after me, but the trail was empty. The forest was still unnervingly silent, though, and I didn't dare linger. I made it back to the outpost just as darkness fell, my mind racing with what I had seen. I radioed the nearest ranger station, but I didn't mention the creature. Just that I had seen something strange on the Lost Lake Loop, and that they should send a team out to investigate. I didn't sleep that night, and when morning came, I drove out to the station to meet the search team. There were 5 of us, including myself, and we set out for the Lost Lake Loop with a sense of unease that seemed to hang over the group. I didn't tell them what I had seen, only that I had found an unmarked trail, and that something had spooked me. The others joked about bears or maybe a mountain lion, but I could tell they were on edge. We reached the spot where I had seen the creature, and the search began. The unmarked trail was just as I remembered it, overgrown and narrow, leading deeper into the forest. We spread out, moving carefully through the trees, calling out to one another every few minutes to keep our bearings. An hour passed, then 2, with no sign of the creature or anything else unusual. Just as I was beginning to think I had imagined the whole thing, one of the rangers called out. We rushed over to find him standing by a large tree, his face pale. At the base of the tree was a pile of bones, human bones. They were old, weathered, some of them gnawed on, but there was no mistaking what they were. A cold dread settled over me as I realized what we had found. The missing hikers, the ones who had vanished over the years, they hadn't gotten lost. They had been taken. The search team quickly radioed for backup, and soon the area was crawling with rangers and police. They cordoned off the site, marking it as a crime scene, and began the grim task of cataloging the remains. I didn't stay to watch. I had seen enough. Back at the outpost, I couldn't shake the image of that creature from my mind. The way it had moved, the unnatural silence of the forest. It all pointed to something beyond the natural order, something that shouldn't exist. I didn't tell anyone about it, not even the other rangers. They wouldn't have believed me anyway. The bones were eventually identified, matched to the records of the missing hikers. The families were notified, and the case was officially closed as a series of tragic accidents. But I knew better. There was something out there in those woods, something that had been hunting for years. As for me, I put in for a transfer, a desk job in the city, far away from the forest. I told myself it was because I was tired of the isolation, that I wanted to be closer to people. But the truth was, I couldn't face the thought of going back into those woods, of risking another encounter with whatever it was I had seen. They sent another ranger to replace me, a young guy fresh out of training. I wished him luck, told him to be careful on the Lost Lake Loop. He laughed, said he wasn't afraid of a little hike. I didn't say anything more. Some things are better left unsaid. As I packed up my things and drove away from the outpost for the last time, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that twisted, hunched figure standing at the edge of the forest. But there was nothing, just the trees, silent and still. The proof of what I had seen was in those bones, in the remains of the people who had vanished without a trace. The creature, whatever it was, didn't need to hide. It was part of the forest now, as much a part of the wilderness as the trees and the rocks. It would go on hunting and people would go on disappearing and the world would keep turning oblivious. But I knew the truth. And I made sure to leave it behind with the trees, with the shadows, and with the silence of the Lost Lake Loop.